The day they buried my daughter, I learned something about grief that nobody tells you. It doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it comes with silence. A cold, heavy silence that sits in your chest like a stone you swallowed whole. And sometimes, in the middle of that silence, someone looks you in the eye and hands you a reason to keep going. Not out of kindness, out of cruelty. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what I am about to tell you is not just a story. It is a warning. It is proof that the people who smile at your dinner table can become strangers the moment they no longer need you. And it is proof that a quiet old woman with a nodding head can be the most dangerous person in the room. My name is Margaret Elaine Calloway. I am 71 years old. I have outlived a husband, a garden full of roses I planted with my own hands, and now my only daughter. Because that is what women like me do. Before we go any further, if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where real stories live. Stories that will make your jaw drop, your heart ache, and your spine straighten with something that feels a lot like justice. Hit subscribe, turn on the notifications, and stay with me until the very end, because I promise you, this story does not end where you think it does. And one more thing before I begin, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. Are you in Texas, London, the Philippines, South Africa? It genuinely warms my heart to know how far these stories travel. So tell me where you are, and let us get into this together. Now, let me take you back. Her name was Vivian Rose Calloway, my daughter, born on a Tuesday morning in April, 38 years before the Tuesday morning they lowered her into the ground. She came into this world fighting. Premature by 6 weeks, lungs like 2 crumpled paper bags, fists already curled tight, like she was ready to argue with the doctor. And she never really stopped fighting after that. She fought for her grades, fought for her career, fought for every single thing she loved, including the man she married. His name was Derek Allen Fowler, and from the first moment I met him, something about him sat wrong with me. Not obviously wrong, not the kind of wrong you can point to and name, just a quiet wrongness, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise beautiful song. He was handsome in that practiced way, the kind of handsome that knows it is handsome. He smiled too quickly and listened too little, and whenever I spoke, his eyes would drift just slightly to the left, like he was already thinking about something more important. But Vivienne loved him, and I loved Vivienne, so I did what mothers do. I folded my concerns into a small, tight square and tucked them somewhere deep, and I smiled at Derek Fowler across every dinner table and holiday gathering for 11 years. When they got engaged, I gave them a gift. Not a blender, not a check. A home, a real one. 7 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a wraparound porch with a view of a lake that turned gold every evening when the sun went down. It had been in my family for 2 generations. My mother had planted the oak tree in the front yard. My father had built the study with his own hands. It was not just property. It was memory. It was legacy. And I placed it in Vivian's hands on her wedding day because I wanted her to always have something that was hers, something solid, something no one could take. The deed was in my name and then transferred legally and formally to Vivian Rose Calloway, not Vivian Rose Fowler. Calloway. The women kept their names on paper where it mattered. I never imagined I would need to remember that detail the way I ended up needing to remember it. For a while, things were fine, or at least they looked fine. Vivienne threw herself into renovating the house, into her work as an architect, into building a life that looked from the outside like everything she had ever wanted. She and Derek entertained often, big dinner parties, summer cookouts, the kind of gatherings where the laughter is loud and the wine flows fast and nobody talks about anything real. I visited often. I kept my opinions about Derek mostly to myself. I watched. I noticed things. The way he spoke over her at parties. The way her shoulders tensed when he walked into a room she had been relaxed in. The way she sometimes called me late at night and did not say very much at all, just breathed quietly on the other end of the line, like she needed to hear a familiar voice. I asked her once, directly, if she was happy. She said yes. Then she said, mostly. Then she laughed that laugh she used when she did not want to cry. 2 years ago, Vivienne was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer, the kind that moves fast and does not negotiate. She fought it the way she fought everything, fiercely and without complaint. She told almost no one, wanting to protect the people she loved from the weight of it. I found out 4 months in, and from that moment I was by her side through every treatment, every appointment, every long afternoon when the house felt too quiet and too large and too full of a future that was rearranging itself without her permission. Derek was present the way furniture is present, physically occupying space without offering warmth or comfort. He hired nurses. He made logistical decisions. He never once sat on the edge of her bed and held her hand through the night, the way I did. Not once. Vivienne passed on a gray Wednesday morning in November, quietly, with her hand in mine, in the bedroom she had painted herself, the color of sea glass, because she said it made her feel calm. She was 38 years old. And 7 days later, standing at her graveside in a coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, Derek Allen Fowler looked at me across the open earth that held my daughter, and said, with the patience of a man who had rehearsed it, "Margaret, I think it is best if you start making other arrangements. You have got 2 weeks." I nodded. I picked up my bag, and I walked away. Now I need you to understand something about that moment, because when I tell people what I did next, the first thing they always say is, "Margaret, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you fight back right there at the grave?" And I understand why they ask that, because from the outside, a 71-year-old woman picking up her bag and walking away from a threat looks like surrender. It looks like defeat. It looks like a woman who has been beaten down so many times she has forgotten how to stand up. But that is not what it was. What it was strategy. See, there is something that happens to you when you have lived 7 decades on this earth, something that younger people have not yet learned and that some people never learn at all. You stop reacting. You start responding. And there is a world of difference between those two things. Reacting is what Derek expected. He expected tears. He expected argument. He expected me to grab his sleeve at my daughter's graveside and make a scene that he could later describe to his friends as evidence of my instability. He had probably rehearsed his response to my reaction the same way he had rehearsed the delivery of the threat itself. I gave him nothing to work with, and that is a kind of power that I do not think he was prepared for. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment. The sky was that particular shade of November gray that has no warmth in it at all. The kind of gray that feels like the world has simply decided to stop trying. I put both hands on the steering wheel, and I thought about Vivienne. I thought about the way she used to run through this kind of weather as a little girl. Arms out, face up, absolutely unbothered by the cold. I thought about her laugh. I thought about the last thing she said to me, 3 days before she passed, when she grabbed my wrist with a hand that had grown so thin I could see every tendon and bone beneath the skin. And she looked at me with those clear gray eyes she got from her father, and she said, "Mama, don't let him have it." I had nodded then too, but that nod meant something entirely different. My first call was to a woman named Patricia Sue. Patricia is 73 years old, originally from Seoul, raised in Boston, and she has been my attorney and my closest friend for 31 years. She is the kind of lawyer who does not raise her voice in a courtroom because she has never needed to. She simply lays out the facts with the precision of a surgeon and waits for the other side to realize they have already lost. When I told her what Derek had said, there was a pause on the line. Then she made a sound that I can only describe as the legal equivalent of cracking her knuckles. "Margaret," she said, "tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the deed. I told her about the transfer on the wedding day, made out to Vivienne Rose Calloway, not Fowler. I told her about the specific language in the original family trust. Language that my own father had insisted upon decades ago. Language that stated clearly that in the event of the death of a direct female heir with no surviving children, the property would revert to the nearest living female relative of the Calloway line. Vivienne and Derek had no children. Derek had never pushed for them, and Vivienne had confided in me once, during one of those late-night phone calls, that she suspected his reluctance was less about timing and more about control. A child would have divided her attention. A child would have given her an anchor that was entirely her own. Patricia was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "He has no claim. None. Not to the property, not to the trust assets connected to it, not to anything your family built. He was a tenant, Margaret. A very comfortable tenant for 11 years, but a tenant. I want you to let that land for a moment. A tenant, in the house my mother's oak tree stood in front of, in the house my father built a study in with his own hands, in the house I gave my daughter as a promise that she would always have somewhere solid to stand. Derek Fowler had walked those floors for 11 years believing they belonged to him by virtue of the ring on his finger. He had never once looked at the paperwork. He had never once questioned whose name was at the top of the legal documents, because men like Derek do not question things like that. They assume. They assume that proximity to wealth means ownership of it. They assume that a woman who nods and walks away is a woman who has conceded. While Derek was presumably back at the house already mentally rearranging things to suit himself, Patricia and I spent 3 days going through every document, every clause, every line. We contacted the county records office. We spoke to the trustee of my family estate, a meticulous man named Gerald Okafor, who had managed Calloway family assets for 20 years and who pulled up the relevant files with the quiet efficiency of someone who had always known this day might come. Everything was exactly as it needed to be. On the 14th day after Derek had given me my 2-week notice, Patricia filed the formal legal notice of property reversion with the county. On the 16th day, certified letters were sent to the address. On the 18th day, when Derek had presumably been waiting for me to show up with boxes and an apology, 2 officers from the local department and a county representative knocked on the front door of that 7-bedroom house with the wraparound porch and the lake view and the oak tree out front. Derek opened the door in a bathrobe. The expression on his face, according to the officer who later described the interaction to Patricia, was one of total and complete incomprehension. Like a man who had been handed a document in a language he had never considered learning, because he had never considered that he might need to. Now I want to pause here for just a moment, because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking, surely he knew. Surely a man who lived in that house for 11 years, who hosted dinner parties in that dining room and parked his car in that driveway and called that address his home, surely he had looked at the paperwork at some point. Surely he had seen whose name was on the deed. Surely he was not that oblivious. And you would be right to think that, because he was not oblivious. Not entirely. What Derek Fowler was arrogant. And arrogance is a very specific kind of blindness. It does not prevent you from seeing the facts. It simply convinces you that the facts do not apply to you. Vivian had told him about the deed early in their marriage. She had been transparent about it, the way she was transparent about most things, because honesty was built into her the way the grain is built into wood. She told him the house was in her name, from her family, and that it would always remain in the Calloway line. Derek had apparently smiled and said something like, "Of course, sweetheart, whatever your family needs," and then promptly filed that information somewhere in the back of his mind, under things that were technically true but practically irrelevant. Because in his version of the world, Vivian was his wife, and what was hers was his, and when she died, the natural order of things would simply continue. He would grieve appropriately for a reasonable amount of time, and then he would move forward, in his house, with his life, having shed the inconvenient weight of a sick wife and the even more inconvenient presence of her aging mother. He had already, Patricia later discovered through channels I will not fully detail here, been in contact with a real estate agent. Not to sell, to rent out 2 of the 7 bedrooms to generate income while he, quote, figured out his next move. He had been making plans in the house he did not own before my daughter was even cold in the ground. When Patricia told me that, I sat with it for a long time. I did not cry. I had moved past crying about Derek Fowler, somewhere around the 3rd year of watching him fail my daughter, in ways that were too quiet to confront directly, but too consistent to ignore. The kind of clarity that comes when a thing you have suspected for a long time is finally confirmed, and you realize that your instincts were never wrong. You were just too hopeful to fully trust them. After the officers delivered the legal notice, Derek called me. I did not answer. He called 3 more times that same evening. I did not answer. He sent a text message that began with, "Margaret, I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding," and ended with 3 sentences that I will summarize as a softened threat, a veiled appeal to my emotions, and a reminder that he and I were, quote, family. I read it once, I showed it to Patricia. She added it to the file. He then called my brother, a retired civil engineer named Thomas Calloway, who is 68 years old, 6'2", and has approximately 0 patience for nonsense of any variety. Thomas called me afterward and said, in his particular way of speaking, which involves very few words and a great deal of weight behind each one, I told him the situation was clear. I did not ask what else was said. I did not need to. Derek hired an attorney of his own, a young man, Patricia told me, relatively new to property law, who sent over an initial letter that attempted to argue spousal inheritance rights and challenged the validity of the trust clause on the basis that it was, and I am using his word here, antiquated. Patricia responded within 48 hours with a document so thoroughly researched and precisely argued that the young attorney reportedly requested a 2-week extension before replying. Patricia granted him 1 week. In the meantime, I went back to the house for the first time since the funeral. I want to describe this to you carefully, because it matters. I did not go back with anger. I did not go back with triumph. I went back because Vivian's things were still there, and they belonged to me now. And I was not going to leave her life packed into boxes in the care of a man who had looked at her death as an inconvenience to be managed. I brought Thomas with me, and Patricia, and a quiet, efficient woman named Rosa Mendez, who had been Vivian's housekeeper for 6 years, and who had wept more genuinely at that funeral than Derek had. We went on a Thursday morning. Derek was not there. He had apparently decided to visit a friend out of town, which Patricia noted was a legally unwise move given the active proceedings, but not one we were going to stop him from making. Walking into that house without Vivian in it was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Her presence was everywhere. In the paint colors she had chosen, in the bookshelves she had arranged, in the small ceramic bowl by the front door where she always dropped her keys. Rosa and I moved through the rooms slowly, carefully, wrapping and cataloging the things that were Vivian's, her books, her drafting tools, the photographs, the jewelry, a handwritten recipe for lemon cake tucked inside a kitchen drawer that made me have to sit down on the floor for 5 full minutes before I could continue. Thomas carried the boxes. He did not say much. But at one point he stopped in the doorway of the study, the one our father had built, and he put one hand flat against the doorframe, the way you might touch the shoulder of someone you love, and he stood like that for a long moment. And I understood exactly what he was feeling, because I was feeling it too. This house had held our family for 2 generations. Our parents had argued and made up and grown old within these walls. Vivian had run through these hallways as a child during the summers we spent here. Every corner held a memory that Derek Fowler had no access to, no matter how many years he had spent walking past them. He had never been the owner of this house. He had simply been a guest who forgot to remember that. Derek's attorney ultimately filed a formal counter-challenge 4 days after Patricia's extended deadline. It was, by all accounts, a thin argument built on emotional language and legal wishful thinking. It cited the length of Derek's residency in the property, his financial contributions to renovation costs over the years, and what his attorney described as a reasonable expectation of inheritance, given the nature of the marital relationship. Patricia read through the entire filing on a Friday afternoon, made 3 notes in the margin, and told me over the phone that evening that she had seen stronger arguments made over parking disputes. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Derek had stood at my daughter's graveside and told me I had 2 weeks to leave. I want you to think about that timeline for a moment. 6 weeks. From the moment he issued that ultimatum to the morning he sat across a courtroom table from Patricia Sue and realized with complete and dawning certainty that he had made the single most catastrophic miscalculation of his adult life. 6 weeks. Vivian used to say that the truth moves slowly, but it always arrives on time. I have never believed that more completely than I did sitting in that courtroom on a Tuesday morning in January, with my hands folded in my lap, and my back straight, and my eyes forward. Derek arrived with his attorney, and 2 people I did not recognize, A man and a woman who appeared to be character witnesses of some kind, dressed carefully in the way people dress when they want to look trustworthy. Derek himself was in a dark suit. His hair was neat. He looked, I will give him this, composed, the kind of composed that takes effort, the kind that you can see the edges of if you know where to look. And I had been looking at Derek Fowler for 11 years, so I knew exactly where to look. His jaw was tight, his left hand, resting on the table, pressed just slightly too hard against the surface. He was afraid. He was very, very afraid, and he was working extraordinarily hard to make sure it did not show. He glanced at me once when he sat down. Just once. I met his eyes steadily, and I did not look away, and I did not change my expression, and after approximately 3 seconds, he was the one who looked away first. I noted that. I filed it quietly alongside everything else I had been filing about Derek Fowler for 11 years. Patricia presented our case with the calm efficiency of someone laying out items on a very organized shelf. The original deed, the family trust documentation, the transfer records from the wedding gift, notarized and witnessed and filed correctly with every relevant authority. The specific clause regarding reversion to the nearest living female relative of the Calloway line in the absence of surviving children. Gerald Okafor, our estate trustee, testified clearly and without hesitation. Every document was clean, every date was correct, every signature was exactly where it needed to be. Derek's attorney stood up and made his argument with the energy of a man trying to fill a room with smoke. He talked about Derek's emotional investment in the property. He talked about the renovation costs which he presented as evidence of ownership intent. He talked about the length of residency. He used the word devastating 4 times in reference to Derek's situation, which I noticed the judge respond to with the particular stillness of someone choosing very carefully not to react. Patricia's rebuttal took 11 minutes. I counted. In those 11 minutes, she systematically and without any visible satisfaction addressed every point Derek's attorney had raised and reduced each one to its accurate legal weight, which was negligible. Emotional investment does not constitute ownership. Renovation costs on a property you do not own constitute the choices of a tenant, not the rights of an heir. Length of residency in a property held in trust by a family with documented and legally sound succession terms is simply the history of an occupant. Derek Allen Fowler had never been on the deed. He had never been named in the trust. He had never, in 11 years, taken a single legal step to establish any formal claim to the property, because it had never occurred to him that he would need to. The judge took 40 minutes to deliberate. 40 minutes during which Derek sat very still at his table, and I sat very still at mine, and the courtroom had that particular quality of held breath that I imagine exists in the moment before a verdict in much larger cases than this one. Patricia sat beside me with a legal pad on which she had written nothing for the past hour, because there was nothing left to write. Thomas sat in the gallery behind me. I could feel his presence there, the way you can feel the presence of something solid and dependable, like a wall you know will not move. When the judge returned and read the decision, Derek closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment. Then he opened them and stared at the middle distance with the expression of a man recalculating every assumption he had ever made and finding the math catastrophically wrong. The property was confirmed as Calloway Family Trust property. The reversion clause was upheld as entirely valid and legally binding. Derek's counter-challenge was dismissed. He was given 30 days to vacate the premises and remove his personal belongings. Any items remaining after 30 days would be considered abandoned property. The renovations he had funded over the years were acknowledged as tenant improvements with no bearing on ownership rights. His attorney requested a brief recess. The judge declined. Outside the courthouse, Patricia and I stood on the steps in the cold January air, and she put her arm around my shoulders, and we stood there quietly for a moment, without saying anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Thomas came out behind us, and stood on my other side, and the three of us just breathed for a while, in the way you breathe when something that has been pressing on your chest for a very long time finally lifts. I thought about Vivian. I thought about her hand on my wrist. I thought about those clear gray eyes, and that voice that still, even now, comes to me in the early mornings when the house is quiet. "Don't let him have it, Mama." I did not let him have it, my love. I did not let him have it. I moved back into the house on a Saturday in February. Rosa came to help me open the rooms back up, and she brought flowers, yellow ones, because she said Vivian always kept yellow flowers in the front hallway, and she did not want the hallway to be empty. I stood at the front door for a long moment before I went in. I put my hand on the door frame the way Thomas had, because I understood now exactly why he had done it. Because some things need to be touched before they can be believed. The oak tree my mother planted was still there in the front yard. The study my father built was still there at the end of the hall. The lake still turned gold in the evening when the sun went down. And the house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they are waiting, patiently and without judgment, for the right person to come home. I am 71 years old. I have outlived a husband and a daughter, and the arrogance of a man who thought a nod was a surrender. I am still here. Standing in my mother's house, under my mother's oak tree, with my father's study at the end of the hall, and yellow flowers in the front hallway because a woman named Rosa understood that some things should never be left empty. And if you are watching this and you have ever been underestimated, ever been nodded at and dismissed, ever been handed a deadline by someone who assumed your silence was weakness, I want you to hear this directly. Silence is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is simply a woman who already knows exactly what she is going to do next, and sees absolutely no reason to announce it in advance. Derek Fowler vacated the property on the 28th day of his 30-day notice. He did not reach out again after the courthouse steps. His attorney sent one final letter that Patricia described as, in her professional opinion, the written equivalent of a man quietly leaving a room. We filed it. We closed the folder. We moved on. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations and raised voices, and the kind of sharp, satisfying exchanges that people replay in their minds for years afterward. This one ended with yellow flowers in a hallway, an old oak tree in a front yard, and a 71-year-old woman sitting on a wraparound porch, watching a lake turn gold in the evening light. Exactly where she was always meant to be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, or someone you love who carries theirs without announcement, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it right now, because there are more stories here. Real ones, human ones, stories about what people do when they are pushed to the edge, and what happens when they push back. We will see you in the next one.